In the shadows of every city, there exists a delicate balance between order and chaos. The thin line between civilization and anarchy is maintained by a complex web of laws, courts, judges, and law enforcement officers who work tirelessly to ensure that justice prevails. But what happens when that system fails? What occurs when the very institutions designed to protect innocent people become tools that shield the guilty from consequence? And perhaps most disturbingly, what happens when someone decides that the scales of justice aren't balanced enough and takes it upon themselves to correct what they perceive as systematic failure? Tonight, we delve deep into one of the most complex and morally ambiguous criminal cases of the modern era. We explore the chilling story of Marcus Chen, known only to the public as the Shadow Judge, a methodical serial killer whose twisted moral code and encyclopedic knowledge of legal loopholes led him to hunt down those society had failed to punish. This is not a simple tale of good versus evil, but rather a disturbing examination of what happens when faith in institutional justice completely breaks down and an individual decides to become judge, jury, and executioner. Detective Sarah Rodriguez had been investigating homicides for 15 years, working her way up from beat cop to lead detective in the city's most elite homicide unit. She had seen everything the criminal underworld could throw at her: gang violence, domestic disputes turned deadly, robbery murders, and crimes of passion that defied explanation. But when she was assigned to what would become known as the Shadow Judge case, she encountered something that would fundamentally change how she viewed both justice and injustice. 7 bodies, all criminals who had escaped justice through technicalities, plea deals, prosecutorial misconduct, or outright corruption. At first, police thought it was an incredible coincidence. 7 separate murders with no apparent connection. Then they found the notes, and everything changed. Each crime scene contained meticulously organized evidence of the victim's unpunished crimes, laid out with the precision of a seasoned prosecutor preparing for the trial of the century. Documents were arranged chronologically, witness statements were highlighted and cross-referenced, and photographs were organized by date and relevance. It was as if someone had spent months, perhaps years, building airtight legal cases against each victim, only to serve as their final judge when the courts had failed to do so. The first victim discovered was Tommy, the Torch, Martinelli, a career arsonist whose nickname had been earned through a decades-long pattern of burning down buildings for insurance money, intimidation, and what appeared to be pure sadistic pleasure. Martinelli had been responsible for at least 15 major fires over a 12-year period, 3 of which had been apartment buildings in low-income neighborhoods. 12 people had died in those fires, including 4 children and an elderly woman who had been trapped on the 3rd floor when the building's only staircase became engulfed in flames. The youngest victim had been a 2-year-old girl named Angela Morales, who died of smoke inhalation while her mother desperately tried to break through a window to reach the fire escape. Despite overwhelming evidence of his guilt, including security camera footage, eyewitness testimony, and even a confession he had made to an undercover police officer, Martinelli had walked free due to what the judge called a fundamental procedural error in how the evidence had been collected. The arresting officer had failed to properly read Martinelli his Miranda rights at the exact moment of arrest, a technicality that resulted in the suppression of his confession and most of the physical evidence. Without the confession and key evidence, the case crumbled, and Martinelli was released after spending only 18 months in county jail awaiting trial. He was found in an abandoned warehouse on the industrial side of town, positioned as if seated in a defendant's chair that someone had carefully transported to the scene. A manila envelope was pinned to his chest with a single silver pushpin, and inside that envelope was a complete dossier of his crimes that went far beyond what police had ever compiled. The file included photographs from crime scenes that had never been released to the public, witness statements from people who had been too afraid to come forward during the original investigation, and a detailed timeline of Martinelli's movements on the nights of each fire. Most disturbing of all, the file contained photographs of each victim, including the children, along with brief biographical information about their lives, their families, and their dreams that had been cut short by Martinelli's actions. Former prosecutor James Walsh was called in to consult on the case after Detective Rodriguez realized that whoever had compiled the evidence possessed an intimate understanding of legal procedures and prosecutorial strategy. Walsh had been practicing law for over 30 years and had prosecuted some of the most complex criminal cases in the state's history. When he examined the evidence files left at each crime scene, he was astounded not just by their thoroughness, but by their legal sophistication. The level of research was extraordinary and terrifying in its implications, he noted during his initial briefing with the task force. Whoever had done this had somehow gained access to sealed court files, witness statements that had been buried in legal proceedings, and even crime scene photographs from cases Walsh had worked on 20 years ago that were supposed to be locked away in evidence storage. This wasn't the work of some angry vigilante acting on emotion and newspaper headlines. This was methodical, calculated, and demonstrated a level of access to the legal system that suggested the killer was either law enforcement personnel, a legal professional, or someone with extensive connections within the criminal justice system. What made the files even more disturbing was their organization and presentation. Each victim's dossier was structured like a formal legal brief, complete with an executive summary, detailed findings of fact, legal analysis of why the criminal justice system had failed to secure conviction, and what appeared to be a formal recommendation for sentencing. The killer had essentially conducted a complete retrial of each case, serving as prosecutor, defense attorney, judge, and jury, all in one person. The final page of each file contained a handwritten verdict and sentence, signed simply as the shadow judge, in precise, almost calligraphic handwriting that suggested both education and an obsessive attention to detail. Marcus Chen was 34 years old when he began his killing spree. A former forensic accountant who had built an impeccable reputation working with law enforcement agencies across 3 states. His colleagues described him as brilliant, methodical, and utterly dedicated to uncovering the truth, no matter how deeply it was buried in financial records, legal documents, or bureaucratic procedures. He had been instrumental in solving several high-profile white-collar crimes, including a complex embezzlement scheme that had defrauded a children's charity of over $2 million, and a money laundering operation that had been used to finance drug trafficking operations across the Mexican border. Marcus lived what appeared to be a normal, even exemplary life. He owned a modest but well-maintained house in a quiet suburban neighborhood, maintained close relationships with his parents and extended family, and was known among his neighbors as someone who would shovel elderly neighbors' driveways in winter and organize block parties in summer. He had been engaged to a pediatric nurse named Jennifer Walsh, and they had been planning a wedding that was supposed to take place in the spring following his arrest. By all accounts, Marcus Chen was exactly the type of person you would want as a neighbor, colleague, or family member. His life changed forever on a rainy Thursday evening in October when his younger sister Lisa was killed by a drunk driver while crossing the street legally in front of her apartment building. The driver was Robert Harrington, a wealthy real estate developer who had been drinking at an expensive downtown restaurant with business associates. Harrington had consumed at least 6 martinis over the course of a 3-hour business dinner, bringing his blood alcohol level to nearly twice the legal limit. Despite this, he had made the decision to drive his luxury sedan home rather than call a taxi or ride-sharing service. Lisa had been crossing the street in a marked crosswalk with the light in her favor when Harrington ran the red light at nearly 60 miles per hour in a residential zone with a posted speed limit of 25 miles per hour. The impact killed Lisa instantly and sent her body flying nearly 40 feet down the street. Harrington's vehicle sustained significant front-end damage, and he was found by responding officers slumped over his steering wheel, reeking of alcohol and unable to stand without assistance. It should have been a straightforward case of vehicular manslaughter, possibly even second-degree murder, given the extreme circumstances of his intoxication and reckless driving. However, Harrington's wealth and connections within the legal and political establishment quickly became apparent. Within hours of the accident, he had retained the services of Morrison, Klein, and Associates, one of the most prestigious and expensive criminal defense firms in the state. The firm's senior partner, David Morrison, was the brother of Judge Harold Morrison, who would later become one of Marcus's victims, for reasons that became clear during the investigation. The defense team immediately began working to minimize Harrington's exposure to serious criminal charges. Through a combination of legal maneuvering, character witnesses who testified to Harrington's charitable work and standing in the community, and what appeared to be backroom negotiations with prosecutors who were more interested in maintaining relationships with the powerful than seeking justice for Lisa Chen, the charges against Harrington were systematically reduced. First-degree vehicular manslaughter was reduced to second degree, then to reckless driving with a fatality enhancement, and finally to a misdemeanor charge of driving under the influence with property damage. The fact that Lisa Chen was a person, not property, seemed to get lost in the shuffle of legal technicalities and plea negotiations. The final insult came when Harrington was sentenced to 18 months of probation, 200 hours of community service that he was allowed to complete by writing checks to charities rather than performing actual work, and a fine of $5,000, less money than he typically spent on a weekend vacation. He never spent a single day in jail, never had his license suspended, and within 6 months of killing Lisa Chen, was back to his normal routine of business dinners and expensive cars. The judge who approved the plea deal noted that Harrington was a pillar of the community, whose charitable work and business contributions to the local economy warranted consideration in sentencing. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a criminal psychologist who would later study the case extensively and interview Marcus Chen multiple times during his imprisonment, explained that Marcus exhibited what experts call moral injury, a deep psychological wound that occurs when someone witnesses or experiences acts that violate their fundamental beliefs about right and wrong. This type of psychological trauma is commonly seen in veterans who have witnessed war crimes, healthcare workers who are forced to deny care due to insurance restrictions, and law enforcement officers who watch guilty criminals walk free on technicalities. In Marcus's mind, the system that was supposed to protect his sister had not just failed her, it had actively betrayed her, and by extension, had betrayed every victim of unpunished crime. The transformation didn't happen overnight. For 2 full years after Lisa's death, Marcus appeared to function normally by all external measures. He continued his work as a forensic accountant, with the same meticulous attention to detail that had made him so valuable to law enforcement agencies. He maintained his relationships with friends, colleagues, and even continued his engagement to Jennifer for several months before they mutually agreed to postpone the wedding indefinitely. He attended grief counseling sessions, participated in victim support groups, and even gave testimony to legislative committees that were considering stricter penalties for drunk driving offences. But behind this facade of normal functioning, something fundamental had broken inside Marcus Chen. He began experiencing what Dr. Vasquez would later identify as a form of complex post-traumatic stress disorder, combined with an obsessive-compulsive disorder that focused specifically on issues of justice and punishment. He would spend hours each night researching criminal cases, reading court transcripts, and identifying patterns in how wealthy or well-connected defendants managed to avoid serious consequences for their actions. What started as an attempt to understand what had happened to Lisa gradually evolved into a comprehensive study of systematic failures in the criminal justice system. Behind closed doors in his suburban home, Marcus was compiling what he meticulously organized and labeled as his justice files. Detailed dossiers on criminals who had escaped proper punishment through legal technicalities, prosecutorial misconduct, judicial corruption, or simple failures of the system to protect victims. He converted his home office into what looked like a combination law library, evidence room, and detective's caseboard. The walls were covered with newspaper clippings, court documents, photographs of victims, and detailed timelines of criminal cases, all connected by different colored strings and pins that indicated relationships between cases, judges, prosecutors, and defense attorneys. The second victim was Maria Santos, a loan shark who preyed on desperate families in the city's poorest neighborhoods. She'd been investigated multiple times, but always managed to intimidate witnesses into silence or disappear evidence through her network of corrupt contacts. Santos was found in her office, surrounded by the predatory contracts she used to exploit people, each one marked with red ink where she'd violated lending laws. A calculator sat on her desk, programmed to show the total amount she'd stolen through illegal interest rates over 15 years, nearly $2 million. The pattern became clear with the third victim. Each crime scene was staged as a symbolic courtroom where Marcus served as judge, jury, and executioner. The victims were positioned formally, their crimes laid out as evidence, and a handwritten verdict was always left behind. The notes were written in Marcus's precise handwriting, always signed the shadow judge, and contained legal language that demonstrated his deep understanding of jurisprudence. Forensic expert Dr. Mitchell Kane analyzed the handwriting and noted the killer's emotional state seemed to evolve with each murder. The first notes were clinical, almost professional. But by the fourth victim, a corrupt police detective named Vincent Torres, who had been selling evidence to criminals, the handwriting showed signs of increasing agitation and righteousness. Torres was found in an abandoned courthouse, positioned behind a judge's bench. Marcus had somehow transported there, wearing handcuffs made from evidence bags labeled with case numbers of criminals Torres had helped escape justice. The investigation intensified when Marcus made his first mistake. His fifth target was Rebecca Stone, a corporate lawyer who had helped chemical companies avoid liability for environmental disasters that caused cancer clusters in 3 small towns. Stone's security cameras captured a partial image of Marcus entering her building, wearing a maintenance uniform he'd stolen from the building's actual cleaning crew. Detective Rodriguez recognized something familiar about the man's posture and gait. Marcus's background check revealed his connection to the Lisa Chen case, and suddenly the pieces began falling into place. His access to law enforcement databases, his knowledge of legal procedures, his forensic accounting skills, everything pointed to someone with intimate knowledge of how the justice system worked and where it failed. When police searched his apartment, they found a converted bedroom that looked like a combination law library and evidence room with files on over 50 potential victims. The walls were covered with newspaper clippings, court documents, and photographs connected by red string like a conspiracy theorist's map. But this wasn't paranoia. It was methodical documentation of systemic failures in the criminal justice system. Marcus had identified patterns in how wealthy defendants avoided consequences, which judges were most likely to dismiss cases on technicalities, and which prosecutors regularly made deals that prioritized conviction rates over justice. Dr. Patricia Mills, a forensic psychiatrist who evaluated Marcus after his arrest, discovered that he genuinely believed he was performing a necessary civic duty. In his mind, he wasn't a serial killer. He was an instrument of justice, filling a void left by a broken system. He showed no remorse for his victims, but expressed deep regret that the system had forced him to take such extreme measures. This wasn't the profile of a typical serial killer who killed for pleasure or control, but rather someone who had appointed himself as society's conscience. The sixth victim, David Chen, no relation to Marcus despite the shared surname, was a pharmaceutical executive who had knowingly sold contaminated medications that killed dozens of children in developing countries. The FDA had been prepared to file criminal charges, but Chen's company settled in civil court, and he faced no personal consequences. Marcus found him in his penthouse office, positioned behind his executive desk, with bottles of the contaminated medication arranged around him like evidence in a courtroom. Marcus's seventh and final victim was the one that led to his capture. Judge Harold Morrison had been taking bribes to reduce sentences for violent criminals for over a decade. 3 of the criminals he'd given light sentences had gone on to commit murders, including a domestic violence case where Morrison had ignored prosecutors' warnings about the defendant's escalating behavior. The victim, Sarah Kim, had been killed by her ex-boyfriend just 2 weeks after Morrison sentenced him to time served and anger management classes. Morrison was found in his own courtroom after hours, positioned in the defendant's chair with his judicial robes arranged around him. But Marcus had spent too long at this crime scene, carefully arranging evidence of Morrison's corruption. Court security found him still there at dawn, standing over Morrison's body like a lawyer, presenting his closing arguments to an empty courtroom. During his interrogation, Marcus was calm, articulate, and chillingly logical. He explained each murder as a necessary correction to the justice system's failures. He had detailed files proving every victim's unpunished crimes and could cite specific legal precedents that should have resulted in convictions. Detective Rodriguez noted that speaking with Marcus was like interviewing a prosecutor rather than a serial killer. He presented evidence, cited case law, and built compelling arguments for why each victim had deserved their fate. The trial of Marcus Chen became a media sensation, raising uncomfortable questions about vigilante justice and systemic failures in the legal system. His defense attorney, ironically enough, argued that Marcus was mentally ill, driven to murder by trauma, and an obsessive need for justice. The prosecution portrayed him as a cold-blooded killer who had used his skills and access to hunt human beings. Both sides were probably right. Marcus was ultimately convicted on 7 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. But the case sparked national conversations about criminal justice reform, prosecutorial accountability, and the psychological toll of systemic injustice on those who work within the system. 3 judges mentioned in Marcus's files were investigated and subsequently removed from the bench. 2 prosecutors resigned amid ethics investigations. The wealthy businessman who killed Lisa Chen was retroactively charged with vehicular manslaughter after new evidence emerged during Marcus's trial. In prison, Marcus continued his obsession with justice, becoming a jailhouse lawyer who helped other inmates appeal wrongful convictions. prison officials noted that he never showed interest in helping guilty inmates escape consequences, only in ensuring that the system worked correctly. He maintained his belief that his actions, while legally wrong, were morally justified responses to systematic failures. Dr. Mills concluded in her final report that Marcus Chen represented a unique type of criminal, someone whose desire for justice became so corrupted by trauma and systemic failures that it transformed into something monstrous. His case serves as a cautionary tale about what happens when faith in institutional justice completely breaks down, and individuals decide to take the law into their own hands. The shadow judge case remains studied in criminology courses as an example of how noble intentions can lead to horrific actions. It raises questions that have no easy answers. What responsibility does society bear when its justice system fails? How many unpunished crimes justify taking justice into one's own hands? And most disturbingly, in a world where Marcus Chen's victims were indeed guilty of terrible unpunished crimes, was he a monster or a dark reflection of society's own failures? Today, Marcus Chen remains in maximum security prison, where he spends his time reading legal texts and writing appeals for fellow inmates. He has never expressed regret for his actions, maintaining that he was simply doing what the system should have done all along. Whether he was a vigilante hero or a serial killer depends entirely on your perspective on justice, morality, and the price society pays when its institutions fail those they're meant to protect.